August 23rd, the year 2000. It was a quiet night in Bahrain. The city lights shimmered on the water. Families gathered for dinner. Children played in the streets. And at Bahrain International Airport, preparations were underway for a routine flight. Gulf Air Flight 072 was making its final approach. On board were 143 people, families, children, business travelers, all expecting to land safely within minutes. But what no one knew was that those minutes would be their last. As the plane lined up for its final approach, a small mistake was made. Then another, and another. One by one, they added up, quietly, dangerously. In the cockpit, the captain and first officer were still trying to land the plane. But something had gone terribly wrong. The plane was getting too low, too fast, too close to the water. In a matter of seconds, the jet plunged into the dark waters of the Gulf. Everyone on board died instantly. Families were shattered. A nation was left in shock. And people began asking, how? How did a routine flight turn into a deadly disaster? Stick around because we're about to reveal exactly what happened on that fateful day. This is the story of Gulf Air Flight 072. At Cairo International Airport, passengers were boarding Gulf Air Flight 072. It was a short-haul flight headed to Bahrain International Airport. The route was familiar. Cross the northeastern tip of Africa, fly over the Red Sea across Saudi Arabia, and then over the warm waters of the Arabian Gulf. It was scheduled to land in Bahrain just before midnight. The aircraft assigned for this flight was an Airbus A320-212, registration A40-EK. It was just over 6 years old and had been well used, with over 17,000 flight hours and nearly 14,000 takeoffs and landings. The plane had passed its last maintenance just days earlier, and everything appeared to be in perfect working order. On board were 135 passengers, 2 pilots, and 6 cabin crew members. Many of the passengers were from Egypt and Bahrain. A large number were Egyptian expat families returning to the Gulf after time with relatives. There were also 3 Chinese workers, stopping in Bahrain before continuing to China, and an American embassy courier, reportedly carrying classified diplomatic materials. In the cockpit was Captain Ihsan Shakib, a 37-year-old Bahraini pilot. He had been with Gulf Air since the late 1980s and had recently been promoted to captain. Although he had over 4,000 hours of total flight time, he had only 86 hours of experience as captain on the A320. His co-pilot was First Officer Khalaf Al-Alawi, a 25-year-old Omani pilot. Young and ambitious, he had joined the airline just a year earlier. Though skilled, he had only 600 total flight hours, and most of those came from training. Together, the 2 men guided the aircraft. The flight was scheduled to depart at 4 o'clock sharp, but a delay at the wrong gate cost them valuable time. The crew was visibly frustrated. That frustration would soon turn into impatience, and later, desperation. Finally, at 4:52, Flight 072 lifted off the tarmac and vanished into the late afternoon sky. No one on board could have known they would never reach Bahrain. After a smooth cruise over the northeastern edge of Africa and across the waters of the Arabian Gulf, Flight 072 began its descent toward Bahrain International Airport. The sun was setting behind the aircraft as it neared its destination. Passengers began gathering their belongings, expecting a safe landing in just a few minutes. But inside the cockpit, the mood was shifting. As the aircraft approached Bahraini airspace, the air traffic controller contacted the crew and asked if they had been cleared down to 3,500 feet. However, Captain Shakib believed they had been cleared to 7,000 feet and instructed his first officer to say so. There was a moment of confusion. The ATC clarified. They were, in fact, supposed to be at 3,500 feet. Realizing they were too high, too close, and running out of time, Captain Shakib pushed the aircraft into a rapid descent. The engines roared louder. Their airspeed increased sharply. Then, another descent clearance came in, this time to 1,500 feet. The crew complied. But in the rush to lose altitude, they gained speed. Too much speed. As the runway came into view, Flight 072 was lining up for runway 12. But the plane was still traveling at over 300 knots, far too fast for a safe landing. There wasn't enough time to fully configure the flaps or slow the aircraft down. Despite the high speed, Captain Shakib pressed on, calling for the landing gear to be lowered and flaps to be set. But the aircraft remained too high and too fast. Standard landing procedures were no longer possible. In that moment, the captain made a sudden decision. He would abandon instrument guidance and try to land visually, even though the aircraft was not properly set up for it. Realizing the approach couldn't be stabilized, most pilots would have executed a go-around. It is a standard, safe maneuver to circle back for another try. But Captain Shakib chose something else. He decided to improvise, a 360-degree left turn, right over the sea, hoping to lose enough altitude and speed to make another attempt. First Officer Al-Alawi informed ATC of the maneuver. The controller approved. At just 586 feet above sea level, the Airbus A320 banked left, beginning its risky orbit with full flaps deployed and landing gear still down, creating significant drag. Inside the cabin, passengers felt the aircraft sway and shudder. Some clutched their armrests as the plane rolled into its turn, subjecting them to unexpected G-forces. There were no announcements, no warnings, just confusion. As the aircraft emerged from the turn, the crew looked for the runway, but it wasn't there. First officer spotted the runway, but it was at 10 o'clock to the nose, meaning the aircraft had only completed a 270-degree turn, not a full circle. The aircraft was misaligned and off course. "We overshot it," Captain Shakib muttered. He finally gave up. The crew informed air traffic control they were aborting the landing. They pushed the engines to full power, raised the flaps slightly, and began climbing again, turning back out over the sea. But now, the aircraft was accelerating fast, too fast. Then came a master caution alarm. A flashing light and loud sound warned the crew that their airspeed was dangerously high, and the flaps could be damaged if they weren't adjusted. Inside the cockpit, pressure mounted. As the aircraft raced through the air with engines roaring, Captain Shakib suddenly pushed the control column forward, sending the plane into a steep dive. The ground proximity warning system screamed, sink rate, but the crew didn't respond. They were still discussing the flap positions. The system called again, whoop, whoop, pull up, but no one pulled up. The plane was now falling fast, nose down, toward the dark water below. The flaps were retracted just before impact. The nose came up slightly, but it was already too late. At exactly 7:30 p.m., Gulf Air Flight 072 slammed into the Persian Gulf at nearly 520 kilometers per hour. There were no survivors. All 143 souls on board were lost in an instant. The nation of Bahrain was stunned. Families waited at the airport, unaware that their loved ones would never arrive. For hours, the aircraft was listed as missing. But deep inside Bahrain's airspace, authorities already feared the worst. The search began immediately. Within minutes of losing contact with Flight 072, Bahraini authorities launched a full-scale emergency response. Boats from the Coast Guard and Civil Defense were dispatched to the suspected crash area, just 5 kilometers off the coast of Manama. But they weren't alone. United States Navy's Fifth Fleet answered Bahrain's urgent call for help. Divers and rescue personnel from the USS George Washington and USNS Catawba joined the mission, scouring the shallow waters where the wreckage lay just 6 to 9 feet below the surface. In all, hundreds of military and civilian responders converged on the scene. It didn't take long for the first signs of tragedy to emerge. Pieces of the aircraft were scattered across the seafloor, and soon, bodies began to surface. Over 50 victims were recovered in the first hours alone. Their remains were carefully transported to Salmania Hospital, the country's largest medical center. Manama Airport was shut down and placed under tight security as news of the crash spread. In both Bahrain and Egypt, crisis centers were set up to care for grieving families. Special flights brought relatives to Bahrain, where the Gulf Hotel served as a central hub for counseling, identification, and emotional support. Inside the hotel, the atmosphere was heartbreaking. Officials read the names of the victims aloud, one by one. As relatives broke down in grief, medics stood by with stretchers and tranquilizers. Some collapsed from the shock. The Emir of Bahrain declared a national mourning period of 3 days. Thousands gathered at Al Fateh Grand Mosque for the official funeral service, attended by top Bahraini leaders. Special prayers were also held across Egypt and Palestine. Even world leaders, including President Yasser Arafat, offered condolences and support to the families. By August 24th, just 3 days after the crash, all 143 victims had been recovered. But one question haunted everyone. Why did Flight 072 crash in clear weather, with no technical failures and just moments from landing? The answers lay inside the cockpit, and the investigation was about to reveal a disturbing truth. The investigation was initially led by Bahraini authorities. However, due to the complexity of the accident, they quickly requested assistance from the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB. The NTSB soon took charge of the investigation, working alongside experts from France, Egypt, and Oman. In total, about 20 investigators were involved in the case. Early reports from Bahraini state television claimed that the plane's engines caught fire before the crash, but air traffic control records showed that the crew never sent a distress call. This was confirmed by voice recordings, which revealed no Mayday signals. Later, the Bahraini Ministry of Transportation dismissed the reports of an engine fire as mere speculation. Eyewitnesses said the plane circled the skies over Manama twice before plunging into the sea. Some saw it trying to avoid buildings in the city. Officials confirmed the plane did circle twice, but Gulf Air's chief pilot, Hamid Ali, denied that pilot error caused the crash. He said Captain Shakib's flying showed no obvious mistakes. The flight recorders were recovered within days and sent to Washington, D.C. for analysis, and the final investigation report was released on August 4, 2002, almost 2 years after the crash. The findings were deeply troubling. According to the report, the crash of Gulf Air Flight 178 was caused by pilot error. The aircraft had no mechanical faults. The engines were working. The weather was clear. The problem lay in the decisions made inside the cockpit. The crew had started their approach too early and too fast. They did not follow standard procedures for a safe landing. The plane descended rapidly, far too steep for a safe landing. Then, at the last moment, the crew attempted a go-around, trying to abort the landing and climb away. But by then, it was too late. The aircraft hit the water at a high speed, just 3 kilometers from the runway. The report also criticized crew coordination and cockpit discipline. It found that the captain was likely overconfident and had become fixated on landing, ignoring safety warnings. The first officer, meanwhile, did not challenge the captain's decisions forcefully enough, a breakdown in communication that proved fatal. In addition, the report pointed to serious problems in training and airline oversight. Gulf Air's training programs had not adequately prepared pilots for difficult landing situations or for proper teamwork under pressure. The release of the final report sent shockwaves across Bahrain and the wider aviation community. At the crash site, a memorial was built along the shore, just a short distance from where Flight 178 went down. The story of Gulf Air Flight 178 reminds us that in aviation, discipline, communication, and humility are not optional. They are everything. If you find this video interesting, consider subscribing for more real-life aviation investigation. And if there's a crash or incident you'd like us to cover, let us know in the comments. Until next time, stay safe.